In 2015, the UN transitioned from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that today, talking about development, we have to talk about sustainable development, which may seem like a formality, just adding the word sustainable, but in certain examples, you can see that it has very, very strong implications. And policy coherence for development or for sustainable development is one of these examples. Maybe to begin with, what does policy coherence mean? Why is it actually important for development?
Basically, the idea is that you make sure, or you seek to make sure, that what the European community or countries are giving with one hand, they're not taking away with another. And if you want to have an example of that, you could talk about the support that the European Commission provides to fisheries groups in West Africa, along the West African coast. And they've put a lot of money into that over quite a number of years. And at the same time, they are supporting European fishing vessels who fish off in the high seas off the west coast of Africa. And what we have found is that high sea fishing has tended to deplete the stocks of fish. And so the local African fishermen have had to move further and further out to sea. And so you had, on the one hand, Europe looking after its own fishermen. On the other hand, it was trying to help African fishermen, but the two were in conflict with each other. And somehow we have to adapt the policies to make them more coherent.
What is the transition then from policy coherence for development to sustainable development?
Well, as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals are more complex. They have they take account of basically three different issues: social development, environmental concerns, and economic concerns. Whereas the MDGs tended to focus largely on the social concerns. We're now trying to really look at a much more holistic, integrated approach to development. And therefore, the idea of policy coherence with sustainable development implies coherence in lots of different directions, not just for development, unidirectional in that direction, but in a lot of different directions. And if you look at the typical SDG, it actually asks adjustments to policies in maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 policy areas. And you have to try and combine these together.
So if you were to think of a concrete example where the PCD, so the policy coherence for development approach, would backfire, would no longer work in the sense of the SDGs?
A number of countries are wary of the PCSD agenda because they would like to focus on particular things first, if you like. So they say, we have a lot of poor people in our country. It is more important to us to make sure that the poor are no longer poor, that we tackle their problems. And it is less important to us to worry about environmental degradation. So we are making a political choice. The poor come first and the environment comes later. Now, the PCSD approach would require you to look at it in a more holistic fashion and say, well, can we achieve a balanced approach to development which both helps the poor with their social problems and seeks to minimize the negative effect on the environment. And if you could find synergies, that would be even better. But at least minimize the negative effects in other areas.
What does it mean for policymakers or for practitioners? There must be certain problems, certain areas where people need to readjust. Well,
one thing is that with PCD, I mean, over 20 years, various ministries of foreign affairs in Europe have adapted or built up a certain experience of how to promote this. And one of the ways they do this is to have consultative systems between different ministries to try and break down to avoid silo thinking and to get different ministries to talk to each other. Now that's all well and good when you have a couple of ministries involved and so on, but when you multiply that and the whole problem becomes larger, the question then is, what do you do? And some people have said, well, PCG is just subsumed into PCSD. But the PCD champions, the practitioners of the past, are saying, well, hang on a minute, we're not guaranteed that the new system will work. In fact, it looks extremely complicated to us, and we're very doubtful about it. Our research has focused around this and also looked at, well, what are the lessons we can learn from the PCD experience, which we could apply to the PCSD experience, and are there other ways of approaching coherence? You have, for instance, mainstreaming ideas, environmental campaigners or policymakers saying, well, you must mainstream environment right through all your development policies and so on. So that was a way of integrating policies that way. There's other thinkers who have approached more things on a more whole of government thing. The European Commission, for instance, when it takes a policy measure, it decides all the commissioners support it. It's a decision of the College of Commissioners, not just one commissioner. There are other ways of doing this. Academics have approached things in terms of nexus thinking. We look at 3 different areas together, and like a common one is water, energy, and food. You need policies in each of these, but can you bring the policies together and think through them in parallel? So there are other ways of looking at policy coherence, and how can we build this into a system for policy coherence for sustainable development?
Interesting. So what do you think is the biggest challenge then now? Is it dialogue, or is it further research, or a mix of both, probably?
Well, dialogue, there is certainly a need for that, in that we are still quite used to thinking in silos. There is, at the moment, at the UN, as you are aware, there's these high-level political forums every year now, which is the monitoring mechanism to review progress on the implementation of the SDGs. What we have found is that there has been some very quick, oh yes, of course we'll all believe in PCSD, that's what we'll do. But we have seen so far very little sort of breaking that down. What does this mean? And what we are hoping is, well, we see a danger in PCD, people digging in their heels and saying, no, our way is better. So we hope to avoid that sort of blockage. But we also think it's important to start doing some research on how different countries are approaching this. Because, I mean, one can well imagine that the solutions are not necessarily just going to be found here in Europe, that the solutions will be found around the world. And can we put together experiences from different areas, different parts of the world, different parts of the globe, different governments, etc., which can lead us to a more a system or an approach which is more commonly accepted. And that research is really only just beginning. There's been quite a bit of research pointing out the linkages, saying, well, this SDG is linked to that one, to that one, to that one, to that one, and creating complex network charts. But then how do you progress from there? That's really, I think very few people have done work on that yet.